We did the key battles part B, which was the Rape of Nanjing, D-Day, and the Battle of the Bulge by me, Rami, and Kristen.
Before World War II, Japan wanted to become as powerful as other countries and started to imperialize in order to expand their nation. They invaded China in 1931 to take over the land and obtain the natural resources to fuel their goal of industrialization. In 1937, Japan took control of parts of eastern China during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was between the Republic of China and the Empire of Japan. After successfully taking over Shanghai, they made their way to Nanjing, which was an important cultural center and the capital of nationalist China from 1928 to 1937. They believed that if they took over the city, then China would surrender and the war would end. What was left of the Chinese forces retreated back to the capital. Nanjing was surrounded and under constant attack from Japan, and their little forces were depleting. The Chinese army already predicted that Nanjing would eventually fall and chose to withdraw their forces to avoid unnecessary casualties. The capital was then moved to Wuhan, China. Abandoning the formal capital would result in political conflict, so the general chose to formulate a defense plan. His strategy failed quickly since the soldiers were exhausted and were running out of ammunition and supplies. On December 13th, the Japanese Imperial Army captured Nanjing, and the next 6 weeks were called the Rape of Nanjing. General Matsui Iwane of the Japanese Central Front Army led the destruction of the formal capital. They wanted the rest of China to surrender quickly. Japanese soldiers committed mass executions, thousands of rapes, looted towns, and destroyed buildings. The massacre ended in January 1938 after the Japanese finally took full control. One-third of Nanjing's buildings were destroyed. It is estimated that 100,000 to over 300,000 Chinese civilians and war prisoners were killed. Between 20,000 and 80,000 women were sexually assaulted or raped and then murdered. After World War II ended, Matsui Iwane and the lieutenant who both not only led but participated in the massacre were executed once being found guilty of war crimes. Japan acknowledged their actions when they surrendered to the Potsdam Declaration in 1945. On August 15, 1955, the Japanese Prime Minister Tomichi Murayama apologized for the events of the Nanjing Massacre. This is still a very sensitive topic that is controversial. The cause of the massacre, casualty counts, and even the massacre itself was debated today.
And after Nanking, the Japanese army continued to commit atrocities, particularly during the fierce struggle in the Chinese countryside, where the Japanese were often attempting to wrest control from Mao's communist army.
When you enter a village, first you steal their valuables. Then you kill people. Then you set the village on fire and burn.
Okay, so the Normandy invasion, better known as D-Day, occurred on June 6, 1944, and it was one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history. An amphibious military assault is basically an assault or a military operation by both land and sea forces. The American, the British, and the Canadian forces allied together in order to invade and to reclaim France. There were 156,000 American, British, and Canadian forces that landed on 5 beaches along a 50-mile stretch of a very heavily fortified coast of France's Normandy region. Preparation for D-Day started when Germany invaded and occupied northwestern France in May 1940. The Americans and the British had started to consider the possibility of a major Allied invasion across the English Channel into France. The invasion was supported by 13,000 fighter, bomber, and transport aircrafts, while the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, were only able to deploy about 400 or less on D-Day. These aircrafts were set to fly through and disrupt and deceive the Germans, as they sent an armada of 3,000 landing crafts, 2,500 ships, and 500 naval vessels out of English ports that very same day. Of course, the Germans didn't just stay and do nothing. They decided to release armored divisions for a counterattack on Allied countries. The counterattack almost reached the sea after driving into a gap between the British and the Canadian 3rd Divisions at Sword Beach and at Juno Beach. If they, meaning the Germans, had made it to sea, the invasion landings could have failed. They didn't make it to sea, however, because they were attacked by British anti-tank gunners, which is very lucky. So this video shows the land invasion, or the invasion from like land and sea and from the air. And so I guess I'll just have to skip around the video a bit.
Stand out of your weapons. Keep those actions clear. I'll see you on the beach.
So that was showing the invasion from the sea, and people went up and fought on the beaches. And next, if I can find it, is the air. As you can see, there are many soldiers that are dropping out from the air and that are going down to the land to fight. And then the last part is when they drop bombs in the invasion.
The Battle of the Bulge, also called the Battle of the Ardennes, lasted 6 brutal weeks from December 16th of 1944 to January 25th of 1945 in the Ardennes region of Belgium. This was the Germans' last major offensive in World War II against the Western Front. The German troops' failure to divide Britain, France, and America with the Ardennes offensive ultimately led to the victory of the Allies. The mid-December timing of this attack was strategic. The freezing rain, thick fog, deep snowdrifts, and record-breaking low temperatures were brutal for the Allies. More than 15,000 cold injuries like trench foot, pneumonia, and frostbite were reported that winter. The Nazis would also set in imposters that changed road signs to attempt to infiltrate the Allied troops, and Germans also changed road signs and spread misinformation. To stop these infiltrators, the US troops would ask suspected Germans to answer American trivia questions. When the conditions finally cleared on Christmas Day, it finally allowed Allied air forces to strike. In the Belgian town of Begeston, the Germans surrounded thousands of Allied troops. In response, they sent in more units, including the famed 101st Airborne Division. The day after Christmas, units of Patton's rapidly approaching Third Army finally arrived and broke through the German lines and rescued the troops. Claiming a victory of the battle on January 25th of 1945, and the Allies headed for Berlin. Less than 5 months later, Germany surrendered on May 7th, thus ending World War II. And then there's our citations.